Welcome to Talking Youth Work. My name is Anita Silva, and together with Rui Branco, we interview experts and practitioners that have a say when it comes to innovation in youth work. This current series is funded by the project Inception of Learning, that is funded by the European Commission through the Erasmus Plus Youth Key Action 2 projects. This project aims to support youth workers, trainers, and educators in delivering quality learning experiences in the field of youth in the context of Generation Z and Generation Alpha. Hello, today we were joined by Elena Avramovska, a researcher working on democracy and young people. Elena is a senior researcher at the Friedrich Ebert Foundation in the beautifully called Democracy of the Future office. How good is that? She leads a program exploring how young people relate to democracy today in Europe. So our conversation explores what Generation Z might be telling us about the state of our societies. We talk about how Gen Z both mirrors the way our societies have treated education and politics, but at the same time they also signal where things might be heading. We talked about how young people relate to politics today in general, and why so many of them don't respond well to the politics that they've been offered, and what that means for democracy. We really went beyond this idea that young people are not engaged and tried to look into why. Why is that happening? Or how is that happening? Or is that really happening? Or are we just taking their participation as a narrative that we have from the past that might look at something different right now? Elena also shared some surprising insights from her research, including why environmental concerns might not rank as high on Gen Z's list of concerns as many of us might expect, including myself. We explored as well the growing gender divide in how people see politics and society. But we also looked into the nuances that underlie that division. All in all, it was a thoughtful conversation about youth, democracy, and the signals that Gen Z is giving us about our own future. So join the conversation. Let's talk youth work. Hello, dears. Hi, Elena. It's nice to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Hi, Rui. How are you today?
Hello, I'm doing good. And you?
I'm very good. I am Zooming from Lisbon, and normally we share where we're Zooming from. So, Rui, where are you Zooming from?
Carcavelos as usual.
And Elena, where are you Zooming from?
I'm Zooming from Vienna.
Okay, Vienna in Austria. Nice.
Exactly.
So today we are talking a little bit about participation, let's say, and democracy issues in Generation Z mostly. And Elena has a lot of knowledge as a researcher on this. And with no further ado, I want to ask you, how did you end up in youth work, or at least as a researcher in the field of youth work? Just shortly, how did you end up here? It's always nice to know how our guests end up in these roles.
Yeah, so I've been doing academic work for the last, let's say, 10 years, so to say. So one way or another, I've been in the ecosystem of doing research, whether it's that's more on the academic side or the policy side, and actually started doing research on democracy in my current job. And young people are a very important part of this work, sometimes even understated and underrated how important it is to understand the political views and actions of young people in the area of democracy. And this is how I ended up there. And I really like to intersect it with other aspects such as gender equality, political participation in general, political polarization, while still having kind of a more concentrated look on young people and democracy.
Fantastic. And from your research, how would you describe that relationship that Generation Z has currently in Europe with politics?
Yeah, this is a very interesting question to reflect what is the relationship of Gen Z with politics, but also to reflect on why is it so important to understand young people when it comes to understanding politics and society in general. And lately, there has been a renewed interest on all sides, and we hear this a lot in the media about what young people are doing, how they're acting politically. And I think it's with a good reason. There was a time a few years ago when research on young people and democracy was somehow on the margins of, let's say, political science and other research in politics in general. And this demographic was analyzed a little bit in isolation from the rest.
Okay.
But what we know now is that it's very important to understand their political opinions, not only to understand them as a specific demographic group, but also to understand society as large. And why is that the case? That is the case usually because some processes or changes that happen on a societal level usually start with the young. Young, in a way, young people and how they behave politically, it's often like setting some trends. They're a little bit
signals something.
Yes, they're signaling what might happen later on. And also how they behave now in their, let's say, formative years, in their adolescence, really signals what kind of voters, what kind of citizens they're going to be in the future. So it's very interesting demographic because it really signals certain things to understand on a broader level.
But it also signals what we've been doing, because usually they're a reaction to something. So they're signaling the future, but also signaling something about the way they've been brought up and what is happening in the present or not.
Of course, yes. So they somehow the crossroads of, on the one side, they mirror what happened in the past, right? And signal a little bit what might come in the future. And we've seen this in many different ways. For example, a lot of protest movements start with young people. Certain social change in different countries start with young people and then somehow spill over to the rest of society. So they are very interesting demographic, I would say, to study.
And what are they signaling nowadays? What are young people signaling from the type of democracy we're going to expect, or what are they worried about in terms of politics?
Yeah, so there are a few different things that are really dominant in different, let's say, in most countries that we study, we see certain patterns. But before discussing this, I would like to preface by saying that we often talk about young people as a monolithic group, but there is so much variation among them, and there are so many different subgroups that is really to keep this in mind. So, for example, when we do survey research, we often also do segmentation analysis and try to cluster them in certain groups depending on certain characteristics that they have in common. And it's fascinating to realize that sometimes the group A would be entirely different from group B in terms of what they do, in terms of their political opinions. And this is dependent on whether they come from the cities or from a rural area. What is the background of their parents? What is their socioeconomic status? What are their general beliefs and attitudes in life? So it's really difficult to have to talk about one specific group, but there's still certain parameters that would say are valid for all of them. And one would be, and we see this in both survey research and focus group research, is that the economy plays a really big role. Young people are very much worried about socioeconomic issues, also about things like corruption. There was a time when understanding young people or analyzing young people was very much about issues such as climate change. And this is slowly dying down. The socioeconomic issues are really taking over. And especially in Central and Eastern Europe, this would be the case. In Northern Europe and in Western Europe, the climate is still an issue that preoccupies them, but to a lesser extent than before. But socioeconomic issues are really somehow present, and there is a general level of anxiety of what the future might bring. So this is something that we see across the board. And they're not very optimistic, I have to say, especially about the future of their own societies. We see lots of pessimism. They're optimistic about their own future. This perhaps comes from the perspective of being so young and thinking you have still your whole life ahead of you. But when it comes to the future of their societies, there is very much lots of pessimism out there.
this sense of doom, right? It's yeah, it's very interesting. And what you're saying, that these causes like climate change that seem to be so present within the younger community are dying down, to give space to relating to politics, but more with the concerns about social economical issues. Does that involve also conflict, worries about conflict?
Yes, fear of war is pretty high, and in general, everything that has to do with, I mean, it's also understandable. Our news is very much filled with issues such as war, conflict, socioeconomic issues, the crisis of housing, rising prices. And this is something that, of course, resonates with them deeply. But what is also interesting, and it's in a way surprising, that when we have certain focus group research in some countries, let's say this was very much prominent in Germany, for instance, young people talk so much about, let's say, healthcare, the pension system, and welfare state. And this is a bit surprising because normally before, when we do research with young people, they're more preoccupied with the things that are more, sort of say, age appropriate for them, such as education, employment. Those are the issues. Now we see this like long-term worrying of young people, where they worry about the issues that normally older citizens would worry, such as pensions, healthcare. There is like really an acute awareness and sometimes a sense of things are not going in the right direction, things are not really working. And this is a sense that somehow cross-cuts political, orientation, party support. So on all sides, there is a little bit of a common sense of maybe things are not going in the right direction.
Yeah, I have a question, because it's making me think a lot about having the people that will have a bigger future because they're younger. They're pessimistic. So if we're designing for pessimism, where do we have hope, or they're less hopeful? And one other thing that what I was listening to you is that, do you feel that use today is more like a thermometer or a thermostat? The thermometer evaluates the temperature of the environment. A thermostat sets the temperature of the environment. Do you feel that they can help design politics that will envision a more hopeful future?
I think there are both. I think that this sense of worrying and distrust in general with politics, it's sensing the environment and reacting to it. But I think they also would understand, and I hope that the politics of the future will have to become more hopeful. There is no alternative. There will have to be some kind of way of having more innovative, different ideas on how to solve certain problems and to increase the general optimism out there, because it's really not a good place to be for anybody, this level of pessimism. And what gives me hope is that they are very much hopeful about their own personal lives. So what I want to say is that this pessimism hasn't spilled over to the, let's say, more personal level. So this gives me hope that maybe this enthusiasm can maybe spill over then to the political level, so to say.
And it's interesting what you said about young people now worrying about the pension system, for example. But at the same time, as I was surprised when you said it, I was also thinking, well, it makes sense. If we have a sense that the world is moving faster, that things are changing faster, that change is, super fast, then yes, I look in 30 years ahead and it's like, well, it's going to be totally different. And most certainly the reality I know today is not going to be here. Therefore, pensions will not be here. So, in a way, it's only logic that as the pace of change increases, we become more worried on the longer term because the level of uncertainty is huge. And of course, that also is a very anxiety-producing fact, right?
Absolutely. Uncertainty is one of the key words that preoccupies the Generation Z. So this question of what the future might look like, and this is very much also related to their sense that this generation is doing much worse than the generation of their parents or grandparents. If you look at statistics, that's not always the case, certainly not in all countries if you just will look at numbers, this might not always be the case, but there is this sense.
There's a perception that that's the case.
That they're doing worse. In one regard, it's perhaps justified when we think about the housing crisis that is happening in Europe, in the US, in many different countries, and young people think, okay, they cannot afford buying a home at all, and maybe their parents could. But there are also different topics to which they think really we are doing much worse than the previous generations. And from there, perhaps they start thinking about different issues such as healthcare, the pension system, everything that has to do with the future, and the future is uncertain, as you said.
Yeah, but it also a mix of you have you only live once and you live for the present. How does this relate to thinking in future? But also another thing is we probably will live longer. Maybe that's one of the reasons also for the concern of having a pension, because if I'm going to live till I'm 90 or 100, I want to have a good life. Otherwise, half of my life will be hell. It's difficult to be optimistic without having like 40 years of your life without a pension.
Yes, that's true. Although, the young people that are particularly worried about the climate, they think that we are running out of time. So there are these two perspectives on the issue.
Contradicting each other.
Yes. So it's like we're going to live longer or we won't, because we have different crises that, the crisis of the fear of war, the fear of climate change. So it's it's a bit complicated. Why is this sense so urgent of being preoccupied more about the future? And there is no, I think, one straightforward answer to this. But what I can tell you from our research, especially in the focus groups, and this is the most telling in a sense, because we have more time to really dig deeper and have follow-up questions, because survey research is very illuminating in one areas, but it has its limitations sometimes that we are not able to go deeper into a certain issue. And they often talk about this sense of that, they say we fulfill our duties in a sense. You go to school, you finish education, you find a job, you try to be a good citizen, in these transformative adolescence years. And then what you get in return, you get insecurity, you get instability. There is this sense of the system is not working as it should be. So I did my side of the bargain. Where is the societal political side of the bargain to kind of do it for me? There is this perception and this sense of things are not really working reciprocally.
So I sense that there is not a trust in the system and by proxy in the political institutions. Is that correct? And what if you have that data, what seems to influence that trust or distrust?
The level of trust is really minimal. There is so much distrust in the political system and in politicians. It's really, really widespread. It's really a common denominator across all political colors, parties, and orientations. Nobody's trusting politicians nowadays. I mean, it's important to mention that this is not so unique to young people. Like all surveys on trust in politics and politicians show that in general there is a very low trust. But for young people, especially, it's really strong. And this is also related to how we often hear this report saying young people are also not interested in politics, for example.
That we hear a lot, even youth workers share that. Yeah.
Yes. And I think that trust politics and this sense of I'm not interested are very much related, because it seems they're not interested in the politics they're getting. Sometimes they think that politics is performative, that, we hear things like in politicians just do whatever they want for their own good. It's like a circus, it's very polarizing. It's just a facade. It's not real, and it's not authentic. So why should we trust it? So it wouldn't be fair, I think, to call the generations that sometimes they call apolitical, or it's really a bit alienated, disillusioned with politics. they really feel not represented. Simply, I think they feel the policies we're seeing, it's not for us. It's not basically catering to our needs, to our opinions. So when there are moments and politics is for them, I think they get more activated. So this generation is very much more interested in specific issues than the system at large. So they don't trust, let's say, political parties. They're not so interested in the conventional side of doing politics, but they would find their own ways of showing political participation. And even though, voting still remains like the number one way of participating in politics for young people as well, and going to protest and so on, it's also to a lesser degree important, but not so much. But when something big happens, and we've seen this with multiple Gen Z protests around the world, when something big happens, whether it is corruption, perception of corruption, of inequality, they can quickly get mobilized and activated in a way where there is some specific issue that really concerns them a lot. So I would say it's sometimes unfair to say that they're so disengaged from politics. They just have their own way of engagement. And if they would be more represented, then they would also feel more inclined to be more active.
But do they feel the need to be part of it? Like, do they feel that maybe we have to go into politics, or our job is just to point to the things, do the protests? Or should I apply also to some
to have
kind
political
of role?
aspirations? You mean?
Yeah.
Well, like when we did some research in, let's say, our most recent survey was in Southeast Europe, and when we asked young people whether they're interested in going into politics themselves personally, we saw that like almost nobody wants to go into politics. It's a very small number, but of those who are interested to go to politics, it's mostly young men. And mostly young men who support far-right parties. So there is something there. The political motivations, what we see in our research, are higher actually on the right of the political spectrum than on the left. And also those young people who identify more with right-wing politics and are more willing to take on political function also report higher perception of knowledge in politics. They think they're more knowledgeable about politics than the other groups. Whether this is true or not, this is just a self-perception, but this is their belief.
Wow. So do you have any hints on why is that, or what is happening in the parties left and right that is more engaging for young people, in this case young men, that identify with right-wing, if I understood, extreme right-wing values? What are the parties doing, or that is capturing their sense of initiative?
Well, we did some research around European elections, the last European elections, and we were really interested in the question how political parties are trying to mobilize young people around different political issues and to mobilize them to vote.
Right.
And it was fascinating because we did the research on, we wanted to look at specifically how parties use social media to mobilize them. And what we realized that parties on the far right were way more skilled in using social media, from both the technical side to the way they package their message, to how they managed to somehow make themselves more authentic, more relatable to young people. And the parties on the left still didn't manage somehow to have their message heard across social media. So there is this gap in the technical skills utilization of social media, but we know that young people mostly get their news from social media channels nowadays, and this is the main driver for mobilization. So it really shows the gap. It really shows how parties, let's say on the more progressive side, need to find ways how to use these tools more efficiently, more creatively, and more in line with what young people want to see.
So politics is becoming like a technical issue, like if you know about social media,
a marketing issue.
Yeah.
Well,
I think there is of course, I think there is a limit. Like you need both, right? You need to have sometimes it's very important, but I think the gains would be short-lived. Even if you manage to win the support of young people and you don't deliver something for them, next time you wouldn't manage to keep the support, right? So the best combination, of course, would be to have a good program, but to also find a way to communicate it much better, to communicate it in a way that resonates and and somehow feels like you talk to them. And this was one of the interesting findings that, when somebody is making videos, when they say, oh, about young people, what young people need, it really to them sounds like you talk about somebody else. And then there are politicians that would point with a finger to the camera and say, you are smart, you are voting for me. You do this, talking to them. And those are really small kind of communication strategies, but it turned out that they had like really big impact.
They work.
Yeah.
What other trends are you identifying in your recent studies? I know you also look into gender issues and polarization. What other trends are now taking place in Gen Z mostly?
Yeah, so the gender issue is really a big one because we've seen over the last maybe 2 to 3 years quite a few media reports saying, okay, young men and women are really diverging in their political opinions, with young women becoming more left-wing and young men becoming more right-wing. And there have been quite a few research on this topic, and usually it can be grouped in 3 areas. So one group tries to understand whether young men and women have different political orientations, in a sense that whether young men would say on this question, how do you identify yourself on a scale from 1 to 10? Left is 1 and 10 is right on the political spectrum. So basically political orientation. The second group of research would try to understand if there is a gender gap in voting. And the third group would try to understand whether there is a gender gap in attitudes towards gender equality, meaning whether young women are now way more progressive in their attitudes towards gender equality than young men. So this would be some of the hypotheses. And the results are mixed. It really depends on the country. It really depends on how the questions are studied. But the biggest gap that we see is usually in attitudes toward gender equality. So this has been somehow the consensus when it comes to voting and political orientation. It's a bit mixed results, although the trend goes a little bit in the direction that we see more young women identifying as left, progressive, voting for left of center parties, and young men more on the right-wing side. So this is kind of the baseline, so to say. But there is lots of nuance there, and especially if we went and did research with focus groups, tried to understand this, and beyond this surface of polarization and split, we find something very interesting. And before actually I go into that, one important thing is to know that this growing split is less about men moving to the right than women moving to the left. So more young women identify as left-wing and faster moving to the left than young men moving to the right. So this is kind of important baseline. And now when we go deeper, we really realize that the divide is not as large, or the backlash against these gender equality positions is not as large as sometimes media tend to report. Beyond this seeming disagreement, there is a baseline of very much agreement of what we discussed earlier, that socioeconomic issues are really the main drivers for dissatisfaction of young people, that the system somehow is not working. So the diagnostic is the same for both young men and women. Where things start to differ is really how they interpret this. What does it mean? And young women tend to interpret this negative political event on a more personal level, and they really are more concerned about social protection, about mental health issues. They really reflect about unequal care responsibilities, about reproductive health rights, and it's more through their lived-in personal experiences. Young men somehow interpret the political insecurities and multiple crises in the world through a little bit sense of loss of status, thinking, will I manage in life? Will I earn enough? Will the status that I will have be lower maybe of that of the previous generation, of my father, of my grandfather? More concerned with the macroeconomic situation of their countries. So they diagnose the same problem and then interpret it. What does it mean for their own lives in a little bit a different way? And then when asked about attitudes toward gender equality, we found it quite fascinating that almost everybody agrees that the basic democratic principle of gender equality should be there, both men and women. Where they start to disagree a little bit is on, let's say, the meaning of the term feminism, for instance. What does feminism do? What is its goal? There sometimes, and especially in some countries, can be a little bit more disagreement present, but the basic idea that equality between the genders should be present is usually there. There is a consensus around it. But there is this sense, underlying sense of scarcity. And sometimes this sense of scarcity and insecurity can create a little bit of zero-sum thinking.
Exactly.
Between the genders. And this is an important message to take.
So young men are feeling threatened?
Yeah, exactly. I was going to ask something on the same lines. Maybe I add to that before you answer, which is, it seems that young males are kind of, from, if I hear well what you were saying, that young men are more prone to blame maybe feminism or these more progressive politics for their lack of status, while young, and maybe young women are doing the same, the blaming men for their lack of equality that they feel in their lived experiences.
Yes, so there is in this, it's perhaps, less of this cultural war that sometimes we hear, but it's really about the socioeconomic crisis for both genders. And in this time when everybody feels insecure, yes, sometimes young men think that some, let's say, affirmative actions such as gender quotas are really possibly endangering their chances for success, and thinking, okay, if you have them in place, then I cannot go forward because, it's not that.
And it's already hard enough. Yeah.
Exactly. And then it's already very, very hard enough. So it really comes from this, like, a bit like zero-sum mentality that gets activated. And I think young women have less of this zero-sum mentality thinking because they also think women were never the dominating gender in society, right? It's not that they lost their status, but in times when they feel a bit the threat, then gender equality becomes a top priority, one of the top priorities for them. It's become very important because it's being more and more attacked on all sides, right? And for men, they sometimes say it's a very important issue, but not as important as the other crises that we're seeing. We see wars happening, we see economic crisis. So it's not as important to them as a gender equality one. And here is the disagreement, like, what is the urgency around this issue and what should we do about it?
Very interesting, very interesting. And in what countries have you been studying these issues concretely?
So this was specifically a focus group research that we did in Germany, in Poland, in Spain, in Greece, and in Sweden.
Okay, very, very interesting. Any other trends that you are identifying beyond the gender issue in the way that Gen Z is relating to politics and political topics?
Oh, we already covered, yes, quite a bit. So it really also depends on which region we are talking about. If you talk about Eastern Europe, migration is also a big issue, but not immigration, it's emigration. Young people are leaving their countries. So we see still high percentage of brain drain from these regions. But we also see an interesting trend that before, especially for this region, young people were mainly motivated to leave and never come back. And now they kind of want to leave their countries for a certain amount of time, and there is an increased interest in circular migration or wanting to come back. And this also is related to a little bit lowering of trust in the European Union, and thinking that the rule of law, democratic participation, and certain other metrics are lower in the European Union, so they don't see it so much as, in general, as an institution with very well perceived rating, although still often they perceive the European Union as better than their home domestic institutions. But there is some shift there.
Mm-hmm. And what was the cohort of countries of that study you've done in Southeast Europe?
So this covers the whole Balkan region, and also covers Turkey, so the Western Balkan 6 region, but we also have Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Greece there.
Okay.
Comprehensive. Yeah. And I was thinking that from your research, do you feel that the young people from Europe, they feel less part of an European whole, or more turning back to the home country values instead of like European values, shared values of an European community?
Yes, and in this research in Southeast Europe, because we had groups so part of the countries were members of the European Union and part of the countries were candidate countries and aspiring members to the European Union. And what was very interesting is that the optimism, or the good perception of the European Union was higher in those countries that are not yet members than in the countries that are already members. And this really shows that maybe there is this expectation or idea, okay, once we join the European Union, things are becoming much better. Then they join the European Union and realize that maybe change takes a lot of time. Some things are better, but maybe not so drastically as they thought. And then the optimism is
drops,
more.
Of course.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
so it's again the trust issue.
And you have
Yes.
another movement is that the countries that are already in the European Union, they get adapted to the things that they already have. It's normal in humans to have hedonic adaptation. What is going well, we start to notice less. So it's both.
Exactly, and it's less aspiring, right? This idea of you aspire
it.
to something. Yes, exactly. Yes. It's true.
Okay, I have just a few. Well, I have a lot more questions, but I'm also aware of time. I wanted to ask you about younger kids. Do you have any research of pointing how they are relating to politics and how youth workers could address this topic with them? Is there any aspect in your research pointing to this younger, maybe Gen Alpha, how they relating to politics?
So we don't do any research on Gen Alpha. So there are just few things that I know that are out there, but I think this research is still taking shape. I think what will be important for this generation, even more so than for Generation Z, is for us to really try to understand the digital environment and the whole media landscape. The Gen Z is already a generation that is growing up and grew up entirely with social media. And this generation will be even more embedded, from AI to social media, all these aspects. I think here there needs to be lots of awareness, research, and understanding what are the effects on young people. And now we already see this trend of many countries trying to even ban social media for under 16. And this is perhaps a debate for an entire episode.
Absolutely.
It's a larger one. But I think here there is some research to be done. But when it comes to what practitioners, civil society or youth workers can do, even if this is about the younger Gen Z or those younger than the Gen Z, I think one main takeaway, I would say, when it comes to practical work, is to be less focused on this issue of just how to activate or how to mobilize young people. We often hear this of how do you activate, how do you mobilize them? And I think the only way to do it is really to gain trust and to offer some solutions to their problem that are really connected to their lived experiences. We see that their main interests are really connected to the lived experience, to what do they need, whether is that in terms of socioeconomic support, whether is that in terms of mental health support. So it's less about you just need to mobilize and activate. It's more about finding some solutions that work with everyday problems, I would say.
And I think it's research on participation in general shows that this is also what works with adults. Actually, when there is lack of mobilization for some reason, people tend not to adhere to the abstract concepts of democracy or participation. That's too far, even if democracy is lacking, even in authoritarian regimes. But people do link with concrete problems that exist and that people can agree upon. And when they see change in those, then they feel activated to act more and look around and look for other issues that maybe we could all change. So I guess it's not a difference than participation for adults.
Yes, exactly. Yes, it goes in the same direction.
It doesn't have to always be big movements. And the thing is that the mobilization can be just in your neighborhood, and that can then expand to other areas. It doesn't have to be like start nationally or internationally.
Yes, this is a very important point and really relates to what we discussed earlier about trust. We know from different research, not only about young people, that really sometimes trust in institutions is made at the local level. If you manage to increase trust in institutions locally, I think lots of things would follow afterwards, and it's often somehow underrated. The local area, we think right away nationally, globally, and how can we do this, on a large scale? But it's indeed you start there. This is something that is really missing, kind of political participation or civic life, also on the local level.
Yeah, because sometimes I feel that we're discussing, oh, we should have pensions, but I have an elder neighbor that I don't help, so.
So there's also the lack of solidarity and social cohesion.
So if I start helping my aging neighbor, won't I help solve other issues?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly.
It relates a little bit with our previous guest we had here, Paul Manier. He was talking about the importance of relationships, and in hearing you now saying that we underestimate the importance of local politics and rebuilding trust in local politics makes me think that maybe youth work would have a role there in connecting young people to the local representatives and fostering a positive relationship there. Maybe that's my hypothesis, that by enhancing the relationship that young people have with local politicians that obviously are more approachable, or hopefully more approachable, more reachable, that could kind of increase their interest in politics and how the system works, in learning about how our society is organized at the political level, but also feeling that they have more agency, that they can talk to our representatives, that we can have a dialogue of some sort, that we can propose change. So that feels like a good tip for youth workers here, which is something that they can do. Anything else that you have for youth workers? I think people would be happy to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also know that young people feel lonely. There is this paradox, right? On the one side, you can meet lots of people online, discuss lots of things online, and yet there is often this sense of loneliness. So working on relationships, community, local community, having real life relationships there, I think is crucial.
Yeah, because the person that is feeling lonely is the real one, not an online avatar that we project.
The persona.
Yes.
So I can have 1,000 friends online, but it's not the real me. And the real me is the one that feels the loneliness.
Exactly. Yeah.
Very well said, Rui. Very well said. Rui, I know we have a question from our previous guest for Elena. Yeah. So Elena, are you ready?
Ready.
Sitting down. And the question is, what are you doing to better yourself to better support others?
Does this relate to the youth and democracy research work, or does this relate to
wherever you want to take it?
Exactly.
That's a difficult one, I would say. But okay, let's stick to our topic of young people and how we understand them. What do we do? I think what I try, or I hope I try to do, is to stay a little bit on top of different maybe methodologies, different tools, different ways to do this, and keep an open mind to try new things of how to research these topics. and how to approach it, because it's not easy. And we know that surveys or whatever research out there is always imperfect, and trying to find new ways to come close to the topic, and also to, have different conversations with different young people, get new ideas, think sometimes out of the box, I think would be something that I like to do even more so, in order to be able to contribute to this field of work even better.
Good. And now you can leave a question for our next guest.
Yeah, so I don't know who your next guest is or what exactly the topic is, but if they also work in this area of young people, whether it is that research or practice, I would like to know what is something they did or learned that really surprised them recently? So something that was really a bit going out of the norm or what is expected.
Very good question. Very good. Elena, thank you so much. I mean, I have listed here a bunch of more questions, and I would have so much curiosity on other issues, but we don't want to take more of your time. And thank you so much for sharing this. Oh, very important. I know that the results of one of your researchers is coming out soon. Do you want to just tell our listeners about that?
Yes, so the research that I mentioned with the focus groups is a project called Equalize, and it will be launched later this month on the 17th of April. And afterwards, it will be available online, so your listeners can have a look. Yes, as soon as it's out there, I will send it to you.
Thank you. And we will add the links to the podcast. And once again, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us and with youth workers across the world. It was really, really inspiring to talk with you.
Thank you both. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks a lot.
This podcast was brought to you by Team Mais, recorded and edited by Rui Branco for the international project Inception of Learning, financed by the Erasmus Plus program. Our great partners for this project are the associations Fundacja Instytut Innowacji from Poland, Jasna Idnina from North Macedonia, and Odd Socks from Montenegro.